Hey everyone, before we get into today's story, I want to ask you something. Where in Canada are you watching from? Drop your province or city in the comments below. I genuinely love hearing from all of you from coast to coast. And if you're someone who believes that life has a way of evening things out when you least expect it, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to hear what happens next. The drive back from Fredericton to Halifax takes just over 4 hours, if the weather cooperates, which it rarely does in November. My sister had dropped me at the arrivals terminal in Moncton, and I'd taken the connecting bus the rest of the way. I'd spent 6 weeks in New Brunswick caring for my mother after her stroke. She was recovering slowly, stubbornly, the way she did everything, but the doctors said she was stable enough that I could finally go home. All I could think about was a hot shower, a cup of proper tea, and the feeling of my husband's arms around me. I was 62 years old, and I was bone-tired in a way that sleep alone doesn't fix. Gerald and I had been married for 31 years. We'd built our life together in Halifax's South End, in a heritage home on Inglis Street that we'd spent years restoring, stripping wallpaper and refinishing floors on weekends when we were young, and full of energy and impossibly hopeful about everything. He'd built Hollis Developments into one of the more respected mid-size construction firms in the Halifax Regional Municipality. I'd spent 27 years as a school librarian at Queen Elizabeth High School, helping teenagers discover that books could crack the world open for them. We weren't rich the way some of Gerald's business partners were rich, but we were comfortable. We had an RRSP, a paid-off mortgage, a small cottage on the Brasdor Lakes in Cape Breton we used every August. It wasn't glamorous. It was ours. The taxi from the bus terminal dropped me at the end of our street just after 9 in the evening. The November air smelled like salt and coming snow. I rolled my bag up the front walk, past the Japanese maple Gerald always threatened to trim but never did, and I dug my house key out of the side pocket of my purse. I slid it into the lock. It turned halfway and stopped. I frowned and tried again. Nothing. I stepped back and looked at the door like it had done something personally offensive. I rang the bell. I heard footsteps, light, quick ones. Not Gerald's. Gerald walked like he was carrying something heavy even when he wasn't. The door opened, and the world I had known for 3 decades simply dissolved. Gerald was standing there in the doorway wearing the burgundy cardigan I'd given him for his 60th birthday. His expression was something I'd never seen on his face before, at least not directed at me. Irritation, and behind it, something worse. Relief, as though my arriving was a problem he'd been bracing for. "Margaret," he said. Not Maggie, not Love, just Margaret, like he was reading my name off a form. "Gerald, my key isn't working. What's happened to the lock?" "I had it changed." I stared at him. "You had it changed. We need to talk." He stepped forward, beginning to pull the door shut behind him, and that's when I saw her. She appeared in the hallway behind him as though she lived there, because, I would soon understand, she did. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled into a casual knot, wearing a silk blouse I recognized immediately, and with a lurch that made my stomach seize. It was my mother's blouse, the ivory one with the small embroidered collar that my mother had brought from her family home in Prince Edward Island decades ago and given to me the previous Christmas, saying she wanted me to have something beautiful. I'd worn it exactly twice. She looked at me with an expression of performed sympathy so polished I understood she had prepared for this moment. "You must be the ex-wife," she said. The word hit me somewhere below the ribs. Ex-wife. I looked at Gerald. "Meredith works at the firm," he said, as though that explained everything, as though that explained anything. I don't remember going down the front steps. I remember standing on the sidewalk in the cold with Gerald a few feet away, his hands in his cardigan pockets, while Meredith remained inside my home wearing my mother's blouse. Gerald was talking. I know that because I could see his mouth moving, but for several long seconds I couldn't make the sounds into words. Then the words started arriving. Done, over, drifted apart, different directions. She understands the business side of things. "You've been in the same library for nearly 3 decades, Maggie. You've never grown. Do you understand how difficult that is to watch?" He said a lot more. He said it with the calm, measured tone of a man who had rehearsed this conversation many times with someone else. He mentioned that all of our marital assets were held through Hollis Developments, legally structured that way for tax purposes years ago, and that my name had been removed from the titles during a refinancing I'd signed without reading carefully because I'd trusted him. He mentioned a settlement offer, printed and waiting in a manila envelope, which he held out to me as though he were handing me takeout. He mentioned that his business partner's brother-in-law was a divorce lawyer and that things would go more smoothly for everyone if I just cooperated. A young man I didn't recognize came from inside carrying a Rubbermaid bin. My winter boots were in it, a few books from my nightstand, my reading cardigan, the things that couldn't reasonably be claimed by anyone else. "You came into this marriage with nothing," Gerald said. "The cottage is in the company name. The house is in the company name. Sign the papers, and this can all be very quiet." He put the manila envelope on top of the bin and walked back inside. The door closed. I stood on Inglis Street in November with $67 in my wallet, a bin of belongings I hadn't packed myself, and 31 years of a life I apparently hadn't been paying close enough attention to. Halifax's waterfront at night in November is not the cheerful place it is in summer. The tourists are long gone. The harbor is dark and restless, and the wind comes off the water with a kind of authority. I drove my 12-year-old Hyundai to the lower ferry terminal and sat in the parking lot for a long time, looking at the lights of Dartmouth across the water. My phone showed 4% battery. I had a portable charger somewhere in my bag, and I couldn't bring myself to look for it. I opened my banking app with numb fingers. Our joint account, the one we'd held together since the early years, when we used to watch the balance nervously every 2 weeks, showed a balance of $0.00. Gerald had transferred everything out. My personal savings account, the one I'd contributed to from my librarian salary every month, had been set up as a secondary account linked to the joint one at his insistence years ago, and it too had been emptied. $2,412 gone. My payroll deposit from my part-time consulting work with the Halifax Regional School Board wasn't due for another 18 days. My sister was back in Fredericton with my mother. I couldn't call her. She had enough. I had a colleague from the school board I might have called, but the humiliation of explaining what had happened felt like more than I could survive at 9:30 on a Tuesday night in November. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I did the only thing available to me. I went through my wallet. Loyalty card for a bookstore that had closed 3 years ago. A library card. My SIN card I kept meaning to leave at home. A small photograph of my father at his desk at the engineering firm, grinning at whoever was taking the picture with that particular grin he had, the one that said he knew something you didn't. He died 11 years ago of a heart attack that came without warning on a Wednesday morning. I still wasn't entirely used to his absence. I didn't think I ever would be. Behind the photograph, my fingers found something stiff and unfamiliar. I pulled it out. A business card, old enough that the stock had yellowed and one corner was bent soft with age. Henderson Patent Holdings Limited. And below that, an address on Barrington Street in downtown Halifax. Below the address, in my father's handwriting, the same precise engineering script he'd used for everything. For Margaret, when the wind turns against you. I turned it over. On the back, also in his hand, account M11. Do not use this until you genuinely need it. I looked at that card for a very long time. My father had been a mechanical engineer his entire career, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who brought his own thermos to work and ate the same lunch every day and was genuinely surprised to learn that other people found engineering difficult. He had worked for a marine equipment firm on the waterfront for over 30 years. He drove a 2003 Civic until it literally could not be driven anymore. He'd lived in the same 3-bedroom house in Bedford that my parents bought in 1978 until he died, at which point my mother moved in with my sister. He had no obvious connection to anything called Henderson Patent Holdings. I had never heard the name in my life. I slept in my car that night, parked in the Walmart lot on Mumford Road, which I understand is exactly as undignified as it sounds. Anytime I closed my eyes, I saw Meredith in my mother's blouse, standing in my hallway, looking at me with that practiced expression. Every time I opened them, I was looking at the card again. I was parked on Barrington Street at 8:45 the next morning. Henderson Patent Holdings occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated Georgian building, the kind of building Halifax does quietly and very well, old bones dressed in careful maintenance. The frosted glass door said Henderson Patent Holdings Limited, Est. 1987. I pushed it open with the hand that wasn't holding my father's card. The reception area was low-key and serious in the way of firms that don't need to impress anyone. Dark wood, framed patent diagrams on the walls, a few technical journals on the side table. The receptionist was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. "Good morning," she said. "How can I help you?" I put the card on her desk. "My father gave me this. His name was Douglas Henderson. He passed away 11 years ago. I don't entirely know why I'm here, but he wrote this for me and I think I'm supposed to come and ask about account M11. She looked at the card. Then she looked at me. Something shifted in her expression. A small but unmistakable movement, like a door being opened from the other side. "One moment, please," she said, and reached for the phone. I heard fragments. "Mr. Carver. The Henderson account. His daughter is here. M11. Yes. Right now. Yes. I understand." She hung up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. It was the expression people wear when they're in the presence of something they've been waiting for. "Can I get you a coffee? We have proper coffee. Not the machine kind." "Please," I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone who'd slept in a parking lot. She brought it in a ceramic mug, not a paper cup, and it was very good coffee, the kind of coffee that tells you the firm takes its clients seriously. I was still holding it with both hands, letting it warm my fingers, when a door down the hall opened, and a man in his late 60s came toward me, tall, silver-haired, in a dark suit that fit him extremely well. He had the careful, measured energy of someone who is always thinking about 3 things at once. "Mrs. Hollis," he said. "I'm William Carver, senior partner. Will you come in?" His office had a window that looked toward the harbor. The walls held framed patent documents, the kind with dense technical language and precise engineering diagrams. In several of the photographs on the credenza behind his desk, my father appeared. Younger than I could easily reconcile with my memory of him, standing beside people I didn't recognize, grinning that particular grin. Mr. Carver asked to see my identification. I handed him my driver's license and watched him examine it, and then type something, and then go very still for a moment while he read his screen. "Mrs. Hollis," he said carefully, "when did you last speak with your father about his professional work? His specific work, I mean, not just his career generally." "We talked all the time," I said, "until he died. But about specifics? Never, really. He was an engineer. He worked on marine equipment. He liked what he did, but he didn't bring it home much." Mr. Carver folded his hands on the desk. "Your father was more than an engineer, Mrs. Hollis. He was an inventor. A prolific one. Over the course of his career, he developed and patented 8 distinct mechanical processes. 3 of them relate to valve and sealing systems used in fluid transport infrastructure. 4 relate to marine equipment adaptation for cold weather operation. 1, and I want you to understand this carefully, 1 became a foundational process in the waterproofing and structural sealing of commercial and residential foundations in extreme climate construction." He paused. "That last one is licensed by construction firms in every province. It's in the building codes of 4 territories. Alberta uses it extensively in resource sector infrastructure. Newfoundland uses it in offshore platform construction. Your father's process is, Mrs. Hollis, inside more buildings than either of us could count." The coffee mug was resting on my knee, and I became suddenly aware that my hand was not entirely steady. "My father lived in a house in Bedford," I said. "He drove a car from 2003. He packed the same lunch every day." "Your father chose to live the way your father chose to live," Mr. Carver said, and there was great gentleness in his voice. "He told me once that he'd seen what sudden wealth did to people and he wanted no part of it. He wanted the work. He wanted the solving of problems. The money was, in his words, not the point." He opened a file on his desk, a physical file, thick and organized with the precision of someone who had been maintaining it carefully for over a decade. "When your father died, he had structured everything into a trust administered by this firm. The trust document specifies 2 conditions under which it activates. The first, you turn 65. The second, he looked up at me over his reading glasses, you access this account in a state of genuine financial hardship." He let that sit. "You're 62, he said. "So condition 1 hasn't been met. Which means I need to ask you, Mrs. Hollis, are you in genuine financial hardship? I thought about the Rubbermaid bin in my back seat, the $67, the emptied bank account, Meredith in my mother's blouse. Yes, I said. My voice held, which surprised me. Yes, I am. William Carver nodded once, slowly, with the gravity of someone completing something that has been a long time coming. Then the trust is activated. All assets and accumulated royalties are released to you effective today. He turned the monitor to face me. Your father's patents continue to generate licensing revenue. The accumulated royalties over 11 years, after administrative fees, amount to $8.3 million Canadian. The projected forward revenue, based on existing licensing agreements and current usage rates, represents an additional $12 to $14 million over the remaining patent terms. I looked at the screen. Then I looked at the window. Then I looked at my hands. He was worth $20 million, I said. More, by certain projections. Though I think he would say the patents were worth that. He'd say he himself was worth exactly what he was, which was, in his view, a man who was good at solving problems. He pushed an envelope across the desk. On the front, in my father's handwriting, my name. I hadn't seen his handwriting in 11 years. I opened it. One sheet of paper, both sides covered in his precise, familiar script. The pen had pressed firmly, the way he always wrote, as if he wanted the words to last. My dear Margaret, he began, if you're reading this, then the wind has turned against you, and I'm not there to stand in it with you, and I'm sorry for that more than I can properly say, but I need you to know something. I saw this coming. Not the specific shape of it. I couldn't know that. But I knew you, and I knew that the qualities I love most in you, your loyalty, your patience, your willingness to give the benefit of the doubt to people who haven't earned it, those qualities would one day be used against you by someone who understood them better than they respected them. I wanted to be ready for that day, so I built something. I built it quietly because that's how I do everything, as you know. I need you to understand that this money is not the gift. The gift is time. Time to think without panic. Time to build without asking permission. Time to choose who you want to be in the years you have left, which I hope with all my heart are many. I know you'll want to give it away, or most of it, because that's who you are. But keep enough for yourself. You spent a long time building a life for someone else. Build one for yourself now. Engineering taught me something I want to leave you with. The strongest structures aren't the ones that resist every force. They're the ones built to withstand the specific forces they'll actually face. You've already survived the worst of it, my girl. Now build. I love you without end. Dad. I read the letter twice. The second time, I didn't cry. The first time I did, quietly, in William Carver's office with the harbor visible through the window and a mug of good coffee going cold on the edge of his desk. When I looked up, he had the tact to be looking out the window. Mr. Carver, I said, I need a few things. Of course, I need access to some funds immediately. Enough to get myself properly situated. A place to stay. Some basics. I'm not asking for much yet. I can have a certified check ready in an hour. Name the amount. $10,000. I surprised myself with how steady my voice was, and I need the name of a good intellectual property lawyer in Halifax. Someone thorough and someone who doesn't know my husband. His expression shifted in a way I found satisfying. I know exactly the right person, he said. Her name is Priya Mehta. She practices out of an office on Spring Garden Road. She's meticulous, she's creative, and she is, when the situation calls for it, completely formidable. Call her, I said. And third, I need a list of every construction project in the Halifax Regional Municipality that has been built using any of my father's patented processes. Hotels, condominiums, commercial developments, everything. William Carver looked at me for a long moment with an expression that was partly professional admiration and partly something else. Something more personal. He picked up his phone. I'll have the list ready by end of day, he said. I rented a furnished apartment in the North End, a neighborhood I'd always liked without ever living in, full of the particular Halifax combination of old houses and new coffee shops and people who nodded each other on the street. I needed somewhere quiet and mine. I paid for 3 months, which felt like a declaration. Over the following 4 weeks, I rebuilt myself from the structural elements outward. I went to my optometrist and got proper frames, the kind I'd always wanted but talked myself out of as an unnecessary expense. A young woman at a boutique on Quinpool Road helped me find clothes that fit who I was rather than who I'd tried not to take up too much space as I cut my hair to just below my jaw, and it turned out this was, apparently, the correct length for my face, a fact I'd been denied for 30 years by vague indifference to the matter. Priya Mehta was everything William Carver had promised. 38 years old, precise as a technical drawing, and possessed of a patience that seemed to sharpen into something else entirely when she was talking about intellectual property law. We sat across from each other at our first meeting, and she opened a file on her laptop and said, "Tell me about Hollis Developments." I told her everything. The structure of the company, the projects Gerald had described at dinner parties over the years, the way he'd reorganized the marital assets without my real understanding, the divorce papers that offered me $7,000, and the contents of the Rubbermaid bin. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Gerald's firm has been the general contractor on how many builds in the last decade? 20? Maybe 25. I'm not certain." She turned the laptop toward me. "William's team at Henderson completed the audit this morning. Hollis Developments used your father's foundation sealing process on at least 11 properties over 8 years. The licensing agreement they held was through a package deal from a materials supplier that explicitly excluded process patents. They didn't license it directly. They didn't license it at all, in the way that matters legally. And what does that mean, specifically? It means that for every one of those 11 builds, your father's intellectual property was used without authorization. Under the Patent Act, that constitutes infringement. Statutory damages in Canada for patent infringement can range significantly depending on whether the court determines it was knowing or negligent. Given that the correct licensing pathway was available and documented and simply not pursued, we have a strong argument for negligent infringement at minimum. She closed the laptop. We would file through Henderson Patent Holdings, not in your name. Gerald won't know who's behind the action. Not initially. I looked at her across the table. "Do it," I said. The cease and desist letter reached Hollis Development's corporate lawyer on a Thursday. I knew because Gerald posted something on LinkedIn that Friday about standing firm against opportunistic litigation, which told me exactly how worried he was. I waited. Gerald had, in the year before I'd left for Fredericton, poured everything Hollis Developments had into a project called The Narrows. Luxury waterfront condominiums on the Dartmouth side of the harbor, across from downtown Halifax, with a view that was genuinely spectacular. He'd leveraged the Bedford Cottage, 3 investment properties, and a credit line secured against our marital home to finance his share of the development. The Narrows was going to be his legacy, he'd said at a dinner party the previous spring. I'd refilled everyone's wine and smiled, and not thought very much about what legacy meant to a man who was already planning the end of our marriage. The construction financing for the Narrows was provided partly by a Toronto-based private lender that paid close attention to its contractors' legal exposure. Patent infringement proceedings, even unresolved ones, had a way of making private lenders very nervous. 3 weeks after the cease and desist, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Margaret." Gerald's voice was careful in a way it had never been with me before. Careful and tired, and underneath the tiredness, something that recognized itself as fear. "Gerald, I need to talk to you. I know this isn't how things are between us right now, but I need to ask for your help. There's a legal situation with the firm. A patent licensing issue, some company out of Halifax we've never heard of, and it's very poorly timed with the Narrows, and I thought, your father was an engineer. You grew up around that world. I thought you might know someone who could help mediate. Someone who could talk to whoever is behind this and make them understand we're willing to resolve this reasonably." I looked out my window at the November street below. "Where would you like to meet?" I said. He chose a cafe on Argyle Street. I arrived 12 minutes early and chose a corner table. I was wearing a charcoal blazer I'd bought 3 weeks ago, and my new glasses, and I was carrying the leather portfolio William Carver's office had given me to hold the trust documentation. I looked like a woman who owned things, which I was. Gerald came in 5 minutes late, which told me he'd been standing outside trying to compose himself. He looked diminished in a way that was genuine and not satisfying in the way I might have expected. He'd lost weight without meaning to. His suit wasn't pressed the way his suits were always pressed. He sat down across from me and looked at his hands. "Margaret, thank you for coming. You said you needed help." "I do. This patent company, Henderson Patent Holdings, they've filed a cease and desist against the firm. 11 projects, apparently, where we used some process without the right license. Our lawyers say we have exposure of somewhere between 2 and 6 million, depending on how aggressive they want to be." And the timing, he exhaled. "The Narrows financing is contingent on the firm maintaining clean legal standing. If this goes to formal proceedings, we lose the lender. If we lose the lender, the project falls apart. If the project falls apart, I lose everything I've put into it." He looked up. "I was hoping you knew someone. In the engineering world, anyone who might have a relationship with whoever runs Henderson." I set my portfolio on the table. "Henderson Patent Holdings Limited," I said quietly. "Established 1987 by Douglas Henderson. My father, Gerald." He looked at me. "The process Hollis Developments has been using without authorization for 8 years is my father's. He patented it. He left everything to me in a trust that activated 6 weeks ago when I showed up at their office with $67 and a Rubbermaid bin of belongings. I let that settle. My intellectual property lawyer has been managing the cease and desist." The color left his face in a very specific and complete way. "You've got to be Margaret. Your father was an engineer at a marine equipment company. My father was an inventor who chose to live quietly. He wanted his work to be his legacy. And his legacy, it turns out, is in 11 of your buildings. This is," he started, and I could see him cycling through emotions in real time and settling, inevitably, on the one he always settled on. "This is revenge. This is personal." "The law is not personal," I said. "You used patented technology without licensing it. That's patent infringement under federal statute. My feelings about your life choices are entirely separate from that fact." "How much?" He leaned forward. "How much do you want?" "I'll find the money. I'll sign over the Cape Breton cottage. Whatever's in my personal RRSP, I'll find a way. Just make this go away, Margaret. Please." I looked at this man I had shared my life with for 31 years. I looked at him clearly and without the particular fog of love and long habit, and what I saw was someone who had confused good fortune with personal merit for so long that he'd stopped being able to distinguish between the two. "What I want," I said, "is for Priya Mehta, my lawyer, to receive a call from your lawyer tomorrow morning confirming that you'll be negotiating the divorce settlement in good faith. The current offer, $7,000 and a bin of books, is not a settlement. It's an insult. She'll send revised terms. The Inglis Street house, a fair division of the marital assets that were fraudulently restructured without my meaningful consent. And my mother's blouse back." He blinked. "Her blouse. The ivory one with the embroidered collar. It was in my closet in our bedroom. It was not yours to give to anyone." He said nothing. "In exchange," I continued, "Priya will instruct Henderson Patent Holdings to settle the patent infringement claim at the low end of the damages range and to structure payment over 18 months, which gives you enough runway to manage the Narrows refinancing. You won't lose everything. You'll lose enough. And if I don't agree, then we pursue the high end of the statutory range, which my lawyer estimates at $5.8 million, with an aggressive timeline that will absolutely trigger your lender's clean standing clause." I picked up my portfolio. "The choice is straightforward, Gerald. Cooperate with a fair divorce and you survive this. Don't cooperate and you find out what it feels like to have nothing." He sat very still. Outside the window, Halifax went about its November afternoon, entirely indifferent to the two of us. "I'll call the lawyer today," he said finally. His voice was barely above a speaking volume. "Tell Priya to expect the call." I stood. I put on my coat. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I'm not doing this because you hurt me, though you did. I'm doing it because my father built something carefully over decades, specifically so that I would never have to accept less than what was fair. He spent his whole life making sure that if someone ever tried to tell me I was worth nothing, I'd have proof to the contrary. I intend to honor that." I left him sitting there and walked out onto Argyle Street, and the cold air felt like the beginning of something. The settlement took 4 months and was in the end handled by the lawyers almost entirely without my direct involvement, which was the right way to do it. I received the Inglis Street house, which I chose to sell because I had no interest in living there again, and every interest in the proceeds. I received a fair share of the marital investments, recalculated from the date of marriage without the fraudulent restructuring. Gerald kept 2 of his investment properties and a smaller credit line, enough to see the Narrows through to completion at reduced scale, enough to start again, which was more mercy than he'd shown me. Meredith, I was told by no one I asked, had relocated to Vancouver. The patent settlement was paid in installments that began in March. My mother's blouse was returned via courier in a dry cleaning bag. I wore it to my nephew's university graduation in June. I established the Henderson Foundation in the spring, named for my father. Its mandate was to fund STEM programming in Nova Scotia schools, with particular emphasis on engineering and applied science for girls and young women from families who wouldn't otherwise have access to those opportunities. Henderson Patent Holdings contributed the administrative infrastructure. The Halifax Regional School Board partnered on curriculum. The first cohort of 12 students received full funding for an engineering camp at Dalhousie in July, and I attended the opening session and watched 12 girls between 14 and 17 years old look at a mechanical diagram and start asking questions, the right questions, the questions my father would have loved, and I thought, there he is, there he still is, in all of this. I met someone at the Foundation's first volunteer orientation. His name was Thomas, and he was a retired geotechnical engineer who'd moved back to Halifax after his wife passed away 3 years ago. He volunteered because his daughter, he said, had been the only girl in her high school physics class, and he wanted to make sure the next generation didn't have to be. He was 64, and he had the particular kind of quiet that comes from a long life lived with real attention. And when he asked me about the Foundation, I found that I wanted to answer him properly, which is not a feeling I'd had in a very long time. On our second coffee, which was at a cafe in the North End near my apartment, he asked me how the Foundation had started, how I'd gone from a school librarian to running something like this. My father, I said, and found I could say it without the grief swallowing the sentence. He was an engineer. He spent his whole career solving problems quietly and putting the solutions away somewhere safe. He told me in a letter that the strongest structures aren't the ones that resist every force. They're the ones built to withstand the specific forces they'll actually face. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was the most remarkable person I've ever known, I said. I just didn't know the full extent of it until after he was gone. I think maybe that was by design. Thomas looked at me over his coffee with the expression of a man who is genuinely listening, which is rarer and more valuable than it sounds. I'd like to hear more about him, he said. If you'd want to tell me. I think I would, I said. And for the first time since November, sitting in a North End cafe with harbor light coming through the window, and somewhere in the city 12 girls learning to ask the right questions about how things hold together, I was not thinking about what had been taken from me. I was thinking about what I was building, what I was, slowly and deliberately, and on my own terms, becoming. That's my story, everyone. From a curb on Inglis Street to building something that I hope will outlast all of it. I mean that genuinely. If this resonated with you, please like this video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and your messages mean more to me than I know how to say. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. I've got more stories about people who held on long enough for things to turn around, and I promise you, you're going to want to hear them. From Halifax, this is your friend at Twisted VST Stories, reminding you that the people who tell you you're worth nothing are usually the ones most afraid of what you'll build once you know your actual value. I'll see you in the next one.